The snow erased the world first. Fence posts disappeared, then the road, then the thin line between sky and earth. Within minutes, the storm turned the farm into a white void where distance meant nothing and direction meant even less. And in the middle of that blinding silence stood something no one in town would ever forget. A horse. Massive. Still. Unshaken by the wind. Snow clung to its dark coat. Its mane whipped through the air like torn ribbons. Steam rose slowly from its nostrils. But what stopped people cold were the eyes. Clouded. Milk white. Blind. The animal could not see the storm. Could not see the crowd. Could not even see the old man leaning heavily against its shoulder. And yet it stood there like a guardian. Arthur Hale's gloved hand was tangled deep in the horse's mane as if letting go might send him collapsing into the snow. His other hand clutched a cane someone had rushed from the house too late to matter. His face was gray from cold. His breath came out slow and painful, but he was alive. Around the yard, neighbors stood frozen in stunned silence. These were the same people who had laughed 5 years ago. The same people who had leaned against pickup trucks outside the feed store and joked about the old farmer who wasted his money on a blind foal. They had called Arthur soft, called him foolish, called the horse useless. Now none of them were laughing, because the creature they had mocked was the only reason Arthur Hale had made it home from the storm. The porch light cast a weak yellow circle across the snow. Mara Hale stood near the steps, both hands pressed to her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. An hour ago, she had believed her father was dead. No one could survive a whiteout like this. Not lost in the tree line, not with night coming, not with a broken leg. And yet, somehow, Arthur had come back through the storm, not alone. A rancher near the gate finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. "How?" he muttered. He stared, directly at the horse's pale, sightless eyes. "How did he find you in that storm?" The question hung in the air, because the truth made no sense. How could something that could not see guide a man through a world that had vanished? Arthur lifted his head slowly. Snow clung to his beard. His breathing shook. For a long moment he said nothing, his hand resting against the powerful neck beside him. Then his voice broke the silence. Echo. The horse's ears flicked at the sound of its name. Arthur swallowed hard. His fingers tightened in the mane. "You brought me back." And in that moment, as the wind roared across the yard and no one dared speak again, the town began to understand something it had missed 5 years earlier. They hadn't been laughing at a blind foal. They had been laughing at a miracle that hadn't happened yet. 5 years earlier, before the storm, before the shame on the neighbors' faces, before a blind horse turned into the one living thing the whole town could no longer explain, Arthur Hale lived the kind of life that made no noise. His mornings began in darkness. Not poetic darkness, not the soft kind that belongs to peaceful country songs. This was the cold, practical darkness of a farmhouse that had aged along with the man inside it. Floorboards that complained, pipes that rattled in winter, a kitchen clock that sounded louder because nothing else did. Arthur woke before sunrise every day without needing to be told. At his age, the body no longer asked permission from sleep. It simply surrendered. He sat up slowly, one hand braced on the mattress, the other pressed against the ache that lived permanently in his lower back. Outside, wind moved through the bare trees like a warning he had heard too many times before. Inside, the farmhouse held the thin chill of a place heated. Carefully, never generously. He dressed in silence, thermal shirt, work jeans, thick socks, the same brown coat with the frayed cuff near the wrist. Nothing wasted, nothing replaced before it absolutely had to be. In the kitchen, he filled the kettle and lit the stove. The blue flame clicked alive beneath it, small and steady. He waited with both hands resting on the counter, shoulders bent, head lowered, not like a man praying, but like a man conserving himself. The coffee was always the same, cheap, bitter. strong enough to cut through the cold. He drank it, standing up. No radio, no television, no voice in the house but the occasional quiet sound he made without meaning to. An exhale, a throat clear, the faint scrape of chair legs across old wood. On the mantel over the stove sat a framed photograph turned face down. Arthur had left it that way for so long that the dust around its edges made a pale outline, a ghost of what it used to be. He knew exactly what was in that frame without looking. Mara, at 17, smiling into sunlight with her hair pulled back and one arm around her mother's shoulders. Arthur stood beside them, younger then, broader, a man who still believed effort could protect what he loved. He did not turn the frame over, not in the morning, not at night. Some griefs did not soften with time. They simply hardened into shape and became part of the furniture. Beside the photograph sat a stack of unpaid bills held down by a rusted horseshoe. Feed, fuel, medicine. A vet invoice folded twice so the total wouldn't stare at him unless he opened it on purpose. Arthur looked at the numbers every few days and then did what proud men in small houses often did. He folded the paper back into silence and went outside to keep moving, because motion felt better than thought. The barn greeted him with familiar smells: hay, leather, dust, old wood, animal heat. There were fewer sounds than there used to be. Fewer heads lifting over stall doors. Fewer bodies shifting in straw. The farm had gotten smaller over the years, not by choice but by erosion. One bad season, then another, then a storm. That storm still lived in him. It had come 3 winters earlier, fast and mean, the kind that rolled across open land with no mercy and no patience. Arthur had lost 6 sheep that night, and 1 pregnant ewe he had tried too long to save. By the time he found them, half buried near the ditch line, their bodies stiff under the snow. Something in him had changed. Not broken, worse than broken. Broken things can be fixed, or buried, or replaced. Arthur had become smaller. Smaller in speech, smaller in confidence, smaller in the private room of his own soul where men decide whether they still trust themselves. He never said it aloud, but he carried one belief like a punishment. If he had moved faster, judged the weather better, checked the lower fence sooner, they might have lived. Other people called it bad. Luck. Arthur called it failure. That was how the town saw him now. Not cruelly, not exactly. No one spat when he walked by. No one drove him out. They still nodded at him in the post office, still lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel when passing on the road. But respect had drained away in slow, invisible drops, and in a small farming town that loss had weight. Arthur could feel it when conversations lowered as he approached, could hear it in the careful tone people used when discussing weather around him, as if storms were a subject he had lost the right to handle. He saw it in the feed store when younger men spoke over him, louder than necessary, performing competence for each other. Folks didn't hate Arthur Hale. They had simply filed him away. An old widower with thinning money, thinning livestock, and too much softness left in him to survive the way modern men believed survival had to be done. Arthur understood all of that without needing it explained. He moved through town like someone entering rooms that no longer belonged to him. At the general store, he bought only what he had written on the list in his pocket. Never more. Flour, lamp oil, salt blocks when he could afford them. Once, a bag of peppermints he put back before reaching the register. At church, if he went at all, he sat near the rear and left before the handshakes started. At the diner, he ordered coffee and nothing else. He had become a man who tried not to need. That was the most dangerous kind of loneliness, the kind that disguises itself as discipline. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the flat gray color that promised another hard night. Arthur stood near the fence line, staring out over a pasture too empty for memory to leave alone. The wind moved through the dry grass with a whisper like old paper being folded. He pulled his gloves tighter and counted what remained. 2 old sheep, a handful of hens. One truck that started when it felt charitable. Enough hay for the month if winter stayed honest, which winter never did. And savings, if that word could still be used, for emergencies only. No mistakes left. That was the truth of his life now. No room for sentiment. No room for rescue. No room for one more thing that might go wrong. And yet, somewhere beneath all that caution, the oldest part of Arthur remained alive, the stubborn, unreasonable part that still reacted when it saw suffering. The part his wife had once loved and his daughter had once inherited. The part the world had punished him for often enough that he had tried, with limited success, to bury it. Toward evening he came back inside, hung his coat, and stood in the kitchen while dusk gathered around the windows. The kettle whistled again. The clock ticked. The house settled into itself like an old animal in pain. On the table lay a folded flyer he had picked up 3 days earlier and tried not to look at since. County Livestock Sale. Saturday. Stock. Tack. Distressed lots. Mixed consignments. Arthur stared at the words. The county sale was where people went to buy what still had use left in it. It was also where things went when no one had the time, money, or patience to keep pretending they mattered. He told himself he might find cheap feed buckets, a spare halter, maybe nothing at all, just to look. That was the lie lonely people often told themselves before walking toward the very thing that would change their lives. His gaze drifted, despite himself, to the face-down picture frame on the mantel, then to the bills, then to the dark window over the sink, where his own reflection looked back at him like a man already halfway faded from the world. Arthur reached for the flyer, folded it once, slipped it into his coat pocket. Outside, the wind sharpened. Inside, something quieter shifted with it. Not hope. Arthur was too old and too bruised for easy hope, but perhaps the smallest, most dangerous cousin of hope, the willingness to look. And by dawn the next morning, with the coffee swallowed hot and bitter in his throat, Arthur Hale climbed into his truck and pointed it toward the county sale, telling himself one final time that he was only going to see what was there. He did not know that by sunset the entire town would have a new reason to laugh at him, and that before those laughs were finished echoing, he would already have chosen the life that would one day save his own. The county sale announced itself before Arthur ever stepped inside. He heard it from the gravel lot, the slam of trailer doors, the rattle of metal gates, the auctioneer's voice cutting through the cold like a blade sharpened by repetition. Men laughed too loudly, boots scraped, engines idled. Every sound carried the same message. In a place like this, value was decided fast, and mercy rarely survived the bidding. Arthur shut off his truck and sat with both hands on the wheel for a moment. He had told himself he was only there to look. A used halter, maybe. A feed bucket. Something cheap, something practical, nothing alive. Nothing that could become another burden. He stepped into the barn anyway. Warmth did not greet him there. Noise did. Harsh overhead lights, the smell of hay, manure, diesel, wet wool, and old wood soaked with years of fear. Men leaned over rails with coffee in hand, judging muscle, bone, and bloodline with the easy coldness of people who had trained themselves to call detachment wisdom. Arthur moved slowly along the aisle, saying nothing. He passed restless goats, 2 underfed dairy cows, a mule with a scarred flank, and a pair of yearlings with bright eyes and better odds. Everything in the barn was being measured against one brutal question. Can it earn its keep? At the far end, laughter burst out sharp and mean. Arthur looked over. A small crowd had formed around a lower holding pen. A trader stood with a rope in one hand and impatience in the other. Beside him, a thick-bodied man with red cheeks and a smug grin was entertaining the others, clearly pleased with himself. Arthur drifted closer. Then he saw the foal. It stood near the back rail, too still for something that young. Its coat was rough and dull. Its legs looked fine, but its posture was wrong. Stiff, uncertain, like every inch of space around it had to be guessed at instead of trusted. Its ears twitched wildly at every voice. Its breathing was shallow. And then Arthur saw the eyes. Clouded, pale, unfocused. The foal was blind. Someone near the rail muttered it under his breath, but loud enough for the others to enjoy. Useless. A few men laughed. The trader gave the rope a careless tug. Born this way, can't work, spooks easy, more trouble than he's worth. The red-cheeked man smirked. So, what's the plan? Sell him cheap, or just pray somebody's stupid? The laughter came harder that time. The foal flinched at the sound and stepped sideways too fast, bumping into the wooden rail. The impact rattled through the pen. Its head lifted, not in defiance, but in alarm. It had no way to read the danger around it except through noise, movement, pressure. Arthur felt something tighten in his chest. Not pity, something closer to recognition. He knew what it meant to stand in public while people quietly agreed you were no longer worth the trouble. He knew what it felt like to be judged by what life had taken from you, not by what still remained. The trader jerked the rope again. The foal stumbled forward. Arthur's eyes dropped to the neck. There, beneath the coarse winter hair, he saw it. A rubbed line, broken skin, fresh rope burn. His jaw set. This animal had not simply been overlooked. It had been handled rough, maybe worse. Another man leaned over the pen. Who'd buy that thing? Blind horse can't even find water. Maybe he can mow somebody's field by accident, another said. The group laughed again. Arthur should have walked away. He knew that. He knew the bills stacked in his kitchen. He knew what winter cost. He knew exactly how much money sat in his pocket and exactly how little room his life had left for mistakes. But the foal turned its head toward the sound of Arthur's boots in the sawdust, not to his face, just to his presence. One ear tipped toward him, then the other. It listened. That small movement struck Arthur harder than all the laughter around him. The trader noticed him. You interested, old-timer? Arthur kept his expression flat. Maybe. The man shrugged. Then take a good look. Nobody else wants him. That was the moment Arthur understood something clearly. If he left, this foal would disappear into whatever people did with creatures they had already decided did not deserve patience. And Arthur had seen enough of that in life. The auction hand approached with a clipboard. You bidding, or just blocking the aisle? Arthur heard himself answer before he fully decided to. Maybe I need a pasture ornament. The line landed exactly how he intended. A joke, dry, casual, small enough to protect the truth. The crowd laughed. Good. Let them laugh at a foolish old man. That was easier than letting them see what had actually happened inside him, because the truth was too plain, too humiliating, too human. I'm not standing here while another life gets erased just because everybody else finds it inconvenient. A few minutes later, the foal was led into the ring. Under the bright lights, the blindness looked even starker. The young horse stood tense, turning its head toward every burst of sound, trying to build a map from voices alone. It did not fight. That was what made it harder to watch. It simply endured. The auctioneer's voice fired across the room. Blind colt, as is, no guarantee. Buyer assumes all risk. Who'll start me at 50? Silence. Then a man near the back raised one finger with a grin. 10. Laughter rippled through the barn. Arthur felt heat rise behind his ribs. The auctioneer tried again. Do I hear 20? Arthur lifted his hand. 25. Heads turned. The red-cheeked man laughed. Well, I'll be damned. Arthur Hale's serious. 30, he called, just to keep the joke alive. More laughter. Arthur looked only at the foal. 50. That quieted the ring. Not because the number was large, because now it was no longer funny. The red-cheeked man hesitated. He had wanted entertainment, not responsibility. He took a sip of coffee and looked away. The auctioneer raised his hand. 50, going once, going twice. The gavel came down. Sold. For one beat, the room stood still. Then the whispers started. Arthur signed the paper with a hand steadier than he felt. The amount on the slip tightened his chest. It was nearly all he could afford to lose. The clerk asked for a name. Arthur looked through the open gate at the blind foal, standing alone amid all that noise, ears moving, body braced, trying to understand a world that had never once made itself easy. "Echo," he said, "because the world gives back what you put into it, sometimes late, sometimes brutally." Outside, the wind had sharpened. Men watched from truck beds and fence rails, their amusement following Arthur all the way to the trailer. "Hope your lawn likes company," one called. Arthur ignored them. He took the lead rope himself. When his hand settled briefly against the foal's neck, he felt the raised welt more clearly this time. Echo flinched, not from pain, but from expectation, as if bracing for the next hard correction. Arthur's face hardened. People always liked to call a creature difficult after they had taught it fear. He loaded the foal slowly, without force, one careful step at a time. By the time the trailer gate closed, the laughter behind him had faded into the wind. Arthur climbed into the truck and stared once through the rear window. He had just bought trouble, mockery, expense, a living thing that would demand patience from a man whose life had almost none left. But as he started the engine, one truth settled inside him with absolute certainty. That foal had not been useless, only unwanted, and Arthur Hale, against reason, against caution, against everything his lonely life had taught him, had done the most dangerous thing a wounded man can do. He had chosen to care. Echo's first night at Arthur Hale's farm did not begin with peace. It began with impact. A hard, splintering thud against the stall wall. Arthur jolted awake in the dark and sat up so fast the old ache in his back flared like a knife. For half a second, he did not know where he was. Then the second crash came. Wood rattling, straw kicking, an animal's frightened breath tearing through the silence, and he was already out of bed. By the time he reached the barn with a lantern in one hand and his coat half buttoned, Echo was trapped inside a panic he could not see his way out of. The foal was slamming sideways into the boards. Not wild, not mean, terrified. His body jerked from sound to sound, every shadow inside that stall pressing against a blindness he could not escape. His hooves slipped in the straw. His shoulders struck wood. His breathing came fast and thin, the breath of something sure the world had closed in around him. Arthur stopped at the stall door. He did not rush in, did not shout, did not do what fear always tempts people to do, become louder than the animal they are trying to calm. He lifted the lantern slightly and spoke into the dark with a voice so steady it almost seemed borrowed from another man. "Easy." Echo froze for one beat. Not calm, not safe, just listening. Arthur took one slow step closer. "Easy now. Easy, boy." The foal's ears flicked toward the sound. His chest still heaved. Sweat darkened the rough coat along his neck, though the night was cold enough to bite through wool. He took one uncertain half-step and knocked the water bucket over with his front hoof. The clang sent another tremor through him. Arthur understood then what the blindness alone could not explain. Echo was not just afraid of darkness. He was afraid of being trapped inside it. Memory lived here too. Something in this young horse had already learned that confusion was followed by pain. Arthur moved into the stall one measured inch at a time, keeping his boots loud enough to track, his breathing slow enough to borrow. When his hand finally reached Echo's neck, the foal flinched so sharply Arthur felt the recoil all the way to his own chest. Then he found the welt again. Raised skin. Old hurt layered over fresh fear. Arthur kept his palm there anyway. "You're all right," he said, though both of them knew that was not yet true. That was the first clue. Not blindness, damage. The next morning brought no revelation, only work. Arthur patched a loose board, reset the bucket, spread fresh straw, and studied the layout of the stall as if structure itself might become mercy. Echo stood near the back corner, head low, ears moving toward every scrape and rustle. He had settled just enough to eat, but not enough to trust. Arthur watched him between chores. The foal mapped the world in fragments. A hinge creak, a boot step, the shift of wind under the barn door. He was listening the way some creatures breathe constantly, desperately, because stopping meant danger. By the third day, Arthur began changing the farm for him. Not dramatically, not with sentiment, with method. He tied small brass bells along the fence posts nearest the barn. Just a few at first, enough for the wind to stir them lightly, enough to give distance a shape. He kept his own voice consistent, never crowding Echo with new tones or sudden commands. Step. Easy. Left. Whoa. Short words, clean words, words a frightened mind could hold on to. By the end of the week, Echo no longer froze at Arthur's approach. He still startled at fast noises, still jerked when a hen burst from under the trough or a gate slammed too hard in the wind. But when Arthur spoke, he listened. It should have been a small, private victory. On farms, though, nothing stayed private for long. The first man to make sport of it was Wade Riker. Wade owned the neighboring acreage to the south and carried himself like the world had been improved by his arrival in it. He was the kind of man who mistook volume for authority and cruelty for wit. Broad through the chest, loud in the mouth, always leaning where he had not been invited to stand. Arthur was fixing a fence line near the road when Wade pulled up beside him in a mud-splashed truck and dropped the window. He did not greet him, just grinned. "So, it's true," Wade called. "You really bought that blind horse." Arthur kept hammering. Wade laughed. "What are you going to do with him, Arthur? Let him lead you around?" The smile that followed was not curiosity. It was performance. A man trying to turn another man's decency into public entertainment. Arthur drove one more nail before answering. "Morning to you, too." Wade's grin widened. "I'm serious. Horse can't see, can't work, can't even spook in the right direction. You getting lonely over there or just collecting bad decisions?" Arthur straightened slowly, hammer hanging loose in one hand. He could have said 100 things. Could have mentioned Wade's unpaid feed tabs, his rough handling, the way animals went quiet when he came near. Instead, Arthur gave him the one thing men like Wade hated most. Very little. "He's mine," Arthur said. Wade snorted. "For now." Then he drove off, still smiling. Arthur watched the truck disappear in a trail of dust and knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Not one who merely laughed, one who watched for weakness and called it opportunity. That was the second clue. By the time Lena Park came to the farm, Arthur had already decided Echo needed someone gentler and more skilled than himself to look at the injuries properly. Lena was the nearest large animal vet tech, practical and sharp-eyed, with a calm way of moving that made nervous creatures choose stillness without fully realizing why. She arrived in a faded pickup with a medical bag, a thermos, and no wasted words. Echo tensed when she entered the stall, but less than Arthur expected. Lena noticed it too. "He keys off your voice," she said quietly. Arthur shrugged. "Maybe." "No," she said, crouching near Echo's shoulder. "Not maybe." Her fingers traced the old marks along the neck and chest with professional care. She examined the rubbed skin near the jawline, the scar tissue higher up, the bruising that had faded badly. Her mouth tightened. "What?" Arthur asked. Lena stood. "These aren't random." Arthur's jaw moved once. "Meaning?" "Meaning this foal wasn't just mishandled by accident." She looked back at Echo. "This pattern comes from dragging, hard corrections, repeated pressure when the animal doesn't understand what's being asked." Arthur looked toward the open barn door, out toward the pale field beyond it, where the world kept pretending brutality was normal if it was done cheaply enough. Lena lowered her voice. Someone wanted him gone for a reason. The barn fell quiet around that sentence. Arthur said nothing. He did not need to, because now the truth had shape. Echo had arrived blind, but fear had been taught. That was the third clue. After Lena left, Arthur stood in the aisle a long time with one hand resting on the stall latch. Outside, the wind nudged the new bells along the fence line. Their faint metal sound drifted through the yard like a language still being invented. Arthur listened. So did Echo. That evening, Arthur began again. No whip, no rope pressure unless necessary, no anger disguised as training. He walked Echo slowly from stall to aisle, from aisle to yard, letting each space announce itself before expecting the foal to trust it. He spoke before every turn, paused before every threshold, repeated the same cues until repetition itself became safety. Easy. Step. Left. At first, Echo moved like a body braced for betrayal. Then, little by little, he began to move like a body learning there might be another outcome. Weeks passed. Then months. The bells multiplied along the fences. Arthur placed them where wind behaved differently, where corners changed, where pathways narrowed. He let Echo hear the water trough before he reached it. Let him smell the grain bin before the feed came. Let the farm become a map built from sound, scent, distance, and trust. And slowly, impossibly, it started to work. Echo no longer crashed into every unknown. He hesitated, listened, adjusted. When Arthur said, left, he turned. When Arthur said, whoa, he stopped. And when Arthur gave 2 short whistles from across the yard, Echo lifted his head, locked onto the sound, and stepped toward him with growing certainty. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Arthur saw it first in the pasture at dusk, when Echo followed the line of the bells without panic and reached the barn door without striking a single post. For a brief second, Arthur allowed himself something dangerously close to pride. That was when he should have remembered a hard fact about broken communities. Some men can tolerate suffering. What they cannot tolerate is the sight of suffering overcome without them. From the road, a truck slowed. Arthur did not need to look to know whose it was. Wade Riker had seen enough, and in the quiet that followed, while Echo stood in the fading light with his blind eyes turned toward the sound of Arthur's breathing, something on that farm shifted. Because success, in the presence of the wrong kind of man, does not always bring peace. Sometimes it invites escalation. In small towns, humiliation rarely happens quietly. It happens where coffee is hot, voices carry, and everyone has time to watch. The feed store sat at the edge of the county road like it had for 40 years, tin roof, cracked wooden porch, the smell of grain and dust hanging permanently in the air. Men came there for supplies, but they stayed for conversation. Weather, prices, politics, and sometimes entertainment. Arthur Hale stepped through the door late one morning with a short list folded in his coat pocket. Salt blocks, chicken feed, a box of nails, nothing complicated. He kept his head down the way men do when they understand how easily attention can turn into trouble. The store owner nodded once from behind the counter. 2 ranchers near the grain bins lifted fingers in quiet greeting. Arthur was halfway down the aisle when the voice cut through the room. "Well, look at that." Wade Riker leaned back against the counter, coffee in hand, grin already spreading across his face. The blind horse rancher himself. The conversation in the store thinned. Not stopped, just slowed enough for people to hear what came next. Arthur didn't respond. He reached for the salt block and turned it in his hands, checking the label. Wade pushed off the counter and strolled a few steps closer. "I've been meaning to ask," he said loudly, glancing around so the others could share the joke. "How's that miracle animal of yours doing?" A couple of men shifted awkwardly. One cleared his throat. Arthur set the salt block in his basket. "He's fine." Wade snorted. "Fine?" He laughed and took a slow sip of coffee. "Arthur, That horse can't see a fence post. You wasting money feeding it or just enjoying the company?" A few uneasy chuckles moved through the store. Arthur kept his voice level. "He's not hurting anyone." That only made Wade grin wider. "Not yet." He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound conversational while still making sure everyone heard. "Thing about animals like that, they're liability. One wrong step, one spooked kick, somebody gets hurt, then lawyers show up." He shrugged casually. "Sometimes it's kinder to put something useless down." The word hung there. Useless. Arthur slowly lifted his head. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Wade expected anger, maybe embarrassment. What he got instead was something quieter. Arthur straightened slightly and set the basket on the counter. "He's not for sale." The words were calm, but they carried weight. The room went still. Wade blinked once, then laughed again. "Who said anything about buying?" Arthur didn't answer. That silence landed harder than any insult. Wade's grin thinned. "Well," he muttered, turning back toward the counter, "don't say nobody warned you." Arthur paid for his supplies and left without another word. Outside, the wind had picked up across the gravel lot. The sky hung low and pale with the promise of colder weather coming. Arthur loaded the truck slowly, his movements deliberate. He had lived long enough to recognize a certain tone in a man's voice. Wade had not been joking. That night, the barn felt wrong. Arthur noticed it the moment he stepped inside. Nothing dramatic, just quiet in the wrong places. The lantern light swung across the stalls as he moved deeper into the aisle. Chickens rustled softly in their corner. The sheep shifted in their pen. Then Arthur saw the latch, the stall door. It wasn't open, but it wasn't closed either. The chain he had hooked there 2 nights earlier hung loose against the wood. Arthur's chest tightened. He moved quickly to Echo's stall. The foal stood in the far corner, body rigid, head low. Straw was scattered across the floor. One of the small bells Arthur had tied near the doorway lay in the dirt, its string snapped. Echo's breathing came fast and shallow. Not injured, but terrified. Arthur stepped inside slowly. Easy, easy. Echo's ears flicked toward the sound of his voice. Arthur crouched and picked up the broken bell. Someone had been here. Someone had opened the stall, maybe only a little, maybe only to see what the blind horse would do when panic filled the dark. Arthur's jaw tightened. For a long moment he stood there, listening to the quiet barn and the wind pressing against the boards outside. Then he got to work. The next morning, he drove into town again. By noon, the barn door carried a new chain and heavy padlock. The stall latch had been reinforced with steel brackets. Arthur installed 2 more bells along the fence line and moved the others higher where they couldn't be reached easily. He began writing things down. Dates, times, anything unusual. Not because he wanted a fight, because he wanted proof. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, Arthur stood at the fence while Echo moved slowly along the pasture line, listening to the soft ringing of the bells in the wind. The blind foal stepped carefully. One post, then another, mapping the world the only way he could. Arthur watched him for a long time. What had started as ridicule had become something sharper, something meaner. Arthur rested his arms on the fence rail and looked toward the distant road where Wade Riker's truck sometimes passed. Then he looked back at Echo. The foal stopped, ears turning toward Arthur's breathing. For a moment, neither of them moved. Arthur felt the truth settle heavily in his chest. This wasn't teasing anymore. It was escalation. The barn looked gentler at night, not softer, just smaller. As if darkness, when it arrived on Arthur Hale's farm, drew a tight circle around whatever still mattered and asked him to protect only that. Lantern light swayed in the aisle, laying thin gold across old boards and fresh straw. Outside, wind moved along the walls with a low winter moan. Inside, the air held the mixed warmth of hay animal breath, and feed mash steaming in a dented metal bucket. Arthur carried the bucket slowly to Echo's stall. The young horse lifted his head at once. Not because he could see the light, because he knew the rhythm of Arthur's boots now, knew the scrape-paws scrape of that left leg, knew the small breath Arthur let out before setting anything down, knew, most of all, the voice that always came before a hand. "Easy," Arthur said. Echo's ears tipped forward. That alone would have seemed like nothing to anyone else. To Arthur, it felt earned. He set the bucket down and rested one hand against Echo's cheek. The horse stayed still. No flinch, no violent brace. Just a tremor under the skin, like fear had not vanished, only learned to wait farther back. Arthur rubbed the jawline gently. "You're all right," he murmured. He had said those words many times by then. Enough that Echo no longer treated them like a trick. The broken bell from the night before sat on a workbench near the stall door. Arthur had not thrown it away. He kept looking at it the way a man looks at evidence when he wishes it were still possible to call something an accident. It was not an accident. Someone had touched that stall. Someone had wanted to see what panic would do to a blind animal in the dark. The thought had followed Arthur all day, quiet and poisonous. That was why Lena Park came back before sunset. She parked beside the barn and stepped out carrying a canvas tool bag and a coil of wire. No fuss, no dramatic sympathy. Lena was the kind of woman who treated pain seriously without ever feeding it performance. Arthur met her at the door. "You didn't have to come." Lena glanced past him toward Echo's stall. "You called." That was her way of saying yes. Inside, she examined the latch, the snapped bell string, the marks in the dirt. Her face sharpened, but not with surprise. "I told you," she said quietly. "Somebody wanted him gone before." Arthur folded his arms. Wade talked big at the feed store. Talk is free. Lena knelt near the post and studied the scratch marks. This wasn't just talk. Echo shifted in the stall at the sound of her voice. Lena stood slowly, keeping her movements plain and readable. "Then we make the place harder to test," she said. So they did. Together, under the lantern glow, they rehung the bells higher along the barn approach and pasture gate. Lena suggested spacing them with intent, not decoration. "Think like he thinks," she said, nodding toward Echo. "He doesn't need pretty. He needs consistent." Arthur understood that. Consistency was another name for mercy when trust had been damaged early. They fixed a motion light above the outer barn door. Arthur cursed once under his breath when the screws resisted. Lena ignored it, handed him the right tool, and kept going. Then they marked a simple route from stall to yard to water trough using sound anchors and repeated cues. No grand training, no miracle, just structure. "Home route," Lena called it, a path Echo could memorize even under pressure. Arthur tested it twice while she watched. Step. Echo moved. Easy. The horse slowed. Left. A clean turn. At the final post, Arthur gave 2 short whistles. Echo lifted his head and came straight toward the sound. Lena's expression changed then, only slightly, but Arthur noticed. "He trusts you," she said. Arthur kept his eyes on the horse. "He listens." "No," Lena replied. "He trusts you." Those words landed harder than praise had any right to. Arthur had once been a man people trusted. Then life had taken enough from him that even his own judgment had begun to feel unreliable. To be told that some living thing now placed its safety in his hands and was not wrong to do so. That struck a place in him he kept boarded shut. He looked away first. Echo reached him and stopped, breath warm in the cold air. Arthur laid a hand on the side of his neck. The horse leaned just slightly into the contact. Not dependence, not weakness. Choice. Lena saw that too. When they finished, the barn looked no richer than before. Same old wood, same narrow aisle, same patched roof and tired hinges. But it felt more deliberate now. more defended, as if care itself had been nailed into the frame. Before leaving, Lena pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket and handed it to Arthur. He opened it. County Livestock Notice, Inspection Standards, Security Requirements. Liability language written by people who never had to choose between feed and medicine. Arthur read the final line twice. Noncompliance may result in fines, seizure review, or livestock restriction. His mouth tightened. One more incident, Lena said, and they'll say the animal isn't safe on the property. Arthur folded the notice back down. He did not curse, did not complain. That was not how fear moved through him anymore. It moved quieter than that. If they find me, he said, I may not cover hay through January. Lena studied him for a second. Then don't give them a reason. Arthur almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, because it was brutally plain, as if decency, expense, sabotage, weather, age, and bad luck were all just items on the same list a man could organize if he woke up early enough. After she left, the farm settled into night again. Arthur fed the sheep, checked the padlock twice, walked the new route once more with Echo under the lantern's swing. The bells answered softly in the wind, each one marking a place, a turn, a boundary that no longer had to be guessed at blindly. When he brought Echo back into the stall, he did not leave at once. He stood there with one hand resting against the horse's face, thumb moving once along the coarse hair below the eye that would never see him. You don't have to see, Arthur said quietly, to be worth saving. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. For a second, the barn seemed to hear them too. Arthur lowered his gaze. It was not a speech. No one was there to admire it. It was only the truth, finally spoken aloud because silence had become heavier than saying it. Echo exhaled and lowered his head. Arthur stayed with him a moment longer, then turned down the lantern and stepped into the aisle. At the barn door, he paused. Beyond the yard, the night stretched wide and black over the sleeping fields. Somewhere out on the road, a truck passed and kept going. The motion light blinked on, then off again. Arthur listened until the sound disappeared. He knew what the notice meant, knew what the broken bell meant, knew what men like Wade Riker did when laughter stopped entertaining them and control became the real appetite underneath. He could walk away, even now. Sell Echo cheap. Call it practical. Tell himself he had tried. A younger man might have chosen pride. A harder man might have chosen convenience. Arthur Hale chose responsibility. He checked the chain one last time. Then the padlock. Then the bells. Inside the stall, Echo stood calm in the dark, listening to the farm Arthur was teaching him to trust. Arthur looked at him through the slats and felt the full weight of what this choice was becoming. More cost, more scrutiny, more danger, and still, underneath it all, something steadier than fear. He chose Echo anyway. That was the quiet thing no one in town yet understood. Arthur was no longer rescuing a blind horse. He was defending a promise. By the time the first hard frost covered the pasture in silver, the entire town had formed an opinion about Arthur Hale. Some said he had grown sentimental with age. Some said loneliness had finally gotten to him. Others said what practical men always say when kindness costs money. A blind horse can't earn its keep. Arthur rarely answered. Not because he didn't hear them, because he had learned something over the years. People who are determined to be right rarely change their minds when shown proof. Every morning, Echo still came when Arthur gave 2 short whistles. Across the yard, the horse would lift his head, ears locking onto the sound, then walk forward with calm certainty, step by careful step, guided by memory, bells, and trust. Anyone who watched closely could see it working, but proof did not stop the whispering. It only made certain people more irritated. The offer came on a cold afternoon. Arthur was repairing a loose gate near the south fence when Wade Riker's truck rolled to a stop beside the road. Wade climbed out slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, the same confident grin on his face that always meant trouble was coming disguised as friendliness. Arthur kept tightening the bolt. Wade leaned against the fence. "Heard the county's sniffing around your place." Arthur didn't look up. "They inspect farms every year." "Not like this," Wade said lightly. Arthur drove the wrench harder against the bolt. Metal clicked into place. Wade watched him for a moment. "Word is, that horse of yours could become a liability." Arthur finally straightened. "He's under control." Wade shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not, but inspectors don't like maybe." The wind moved across the open pasture behind them. Farther off, Echo stood inside the fence line, head tilted slightly, listening to the distant sounds of the two men talking. Wade followed Arthur's gaze. Then he smiled again. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll take him off your hands." Arthur said nothing. "Save you the trouble. Save you the fine, too." He named a price, low enough to be insulting, high enough to tempt a tired man who had bills waiting on the kitchen table. Arthur understood the offer immediately. It wasn't generosity. It was control. Wade wanted the story to end the way he had predicted from the beginning. The blind horse gone. Arthur proven foolish. The world restored to its proper order. Arthur rested the wrench on the fence rail. "No." The answer came so calmly, Wade almost didn't react. "You sure?" "Yes." Wade's smile thinned. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Arthur met his eyes. "You're confusing me with someone asking permission." For a second, neither man spoke. Then Wade laughed, but the sound carried no humor now. "Suit yourself." He climbed back into his truck and slammed the door hard. Gravel sprayed as he pulled away down the road. Arthur watched the dust settle behind the tires. Then he finished the gate. That evening, he drove into town and did something his pride had resisted for weeks. He made everything official. Registration papers, vaccination records, property inspection forms, security compliance for the barn stall. Every document the county required to prove Echo was not being kept carelessly. The fees hurt, but losing ground would hurt more. When Arthur returned home, the sun was already sliding toward the hills. A second car sat in the yard, smaller than the trucks that usually came through. Clean, city tires. Arthur stopped halfway up the driveway. Mara stood beside the car with her arms folded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She looked older than the photograph on the mantel, harder around the edges, but the resemblance to her mother was still there in the eyes. "I heard things," she said. "That usually means Wade talked first." She glanced toward the barn. "People are saying you bought a blind horse." Arthur shrugged. "That part's true." Mara exhaled slowly. "Dad, what are you doing?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked toward the pasture fence and gave 2 short whistles. Across the yard, Echo lifted his head immediately. The horse turned toward the sound and began walking forward, slow, steady, confident. Each step careful but certain. He reached the fence without touching a single post. Mara watched the entire thing. Her expression changed. How did he do that? Arthur rested one arm on the rail. "He listens." Echo reached them and lowered his head slightly. Arthur ran a hand along the horse's neck. For a moment, the yard stayed quiet except for the wind moving through the fence bells. Then Mara asked the question she'd been carrying since she arrived. "Dad, what happens if you get hurt out here?" Arthur didn't look away from the pasture. "Then I deal with it. That's not a plan. It's the truth." She shook her head, frustration rising. "You can't keep risking everything for one animal." Arthur finally turned toward her. "I won't abandon what depends on me." The words landed heavier than he intended, because both of them knew the sentence meant more than the horse. It meant the farm, the promises he still carried, the mistakes he was still trying to live past. Mara looked away first. Dusk began to gather over the fields. Arthur stepped onto the porch and studied the sky. The color had changed. Too pale, too flat. Wind swept low across the pasture, carrying the distant sound of sheep still near the tree line. Mara followed his gaze. That storm's moving fast. Arthur was already pulling on his coat. I need to bring them in. You can wait it out. If I do, they'll be trapped out there. The wind rose another notch. Snow began drifting sideways across the far field. Mara stepped closer. Dad, please be careful. Arthur nodded once. Then he headed toward the gate and stepped into the whitening pasture. Behind him, Echo lifted his head and listened as the storm began to swallow the land. The storm did not arrive like weather. It arrived like erasure. 1 minute, Arthur Hale could still make out the broken line of the trees and the pale shapes of his sheep moving in panic near the far edge of the pasture. The next, the world collapsed into white. Wind drove snow sideways across the field so hard it felt less like winter and more like punishment. Distance disappeared. Sound bent strangely. The land he had known for decades turned unfamiliar in under a minute. Arthur kept moving. That was the first mistake. Not because the sheep did not matter. They did. That was exactly why he kept going. Because responsibility had shaped him for so long that turning back felt more dangerous than pressing on. He found 2 of the sheep and forced them toward the lower fence, using his voice, the crook of his arm, the little scraps of instinct old farmers rely on when the world stops cooperating. Then his boot hit buried ice beneath the snow. His leg went out. He fell hard. The crack came fast and private, somewhere below the knee, followed by a bolt of pain so bright it blanked his breath clean out of him. Arthur rolled once, tried to rise, and collapsed again. The wind instantly began covering the shape of him, packing snow against his coat, filling the crease of his collar, biting through wool and denim and pride alike. He tried to shout. The storm swallowed it. He tried again, louder, but pain narrowed the sound. Cold did the rest. Within minutes, his hands no longer felt like hands. They felt like borrowed things. The tree line had vanished. The fence had vanished. Even the sky seemed to have disappeared, leaving him pinned inside a white space with no edge and no witness. At the house, Mara knew before anyone said it, knew from the time, from the way the yard had gone from gray to white to almost invisible, from the fact that Arthur should have been back already. She stood at the porch window staring into the storm until dread became motion. Then she grabbed her coat and ran outside, calling his name into wind that gave nothing back. Neighbors began arriving in pieces. One truck, then another. Headlights blurred against the snow. Men shouted ideas more than plans. Someone said they needed ropes. Someone else said nobody could see 10 feet. A woman from up the road wrapped a blanket around Mara's shoulders, but Mara barely noticed. Wade Riker was there too. Of course he was. Front row for possible tragedy. Jaw tight, eyes flicking between the barn and the field as if even now some part of him expected the night to prove him right. Mara turned toward the pasture again and saw nothing. No movement, no shape, no father. Then, with panic stripping thought down to instinct, she ran for the barn. The padlock fought her fingers. She fumbled once, cursed, tried again, and got it open. The stall door swung wide. Echo lifted his head before she spoke. The horse had been listening the whole time to the wind, to the shouting, to the imbalance in the farm's usual sound. He shifted once, tense and ready. Mara didn't think. She didn't make a plan or weigh consequences. She only heard her father's absence like a wound in the world and acted from the raw center of fear. "Go," she whispered, voice breaking. "Go find him." Echo surged past her into the white, not wild, not confused, certain. That was the cruel miracle of the moment. The storm had made everyone else blind. But Echo had lived in blindness for 5 years. The terror ruling the yard was not new to him. He did not lose the world when sight disappeared, because he had never depended on sight to begin with. Out in the field, Arthur was slipping in and out of clarity. Cold had begun doing its quiet work. Pain came in waves now, sharp when he moved, distant when he stopped. He knew enough to fear the numbness settling in. He knew enough to understand that if he let himself close his eyes too long, the storm might finish what the fall had started. Then, through the wind, another sound reached him. Not loud, not magical, a rhythm. Hoofbeats, careful and uneven against buried ground. Arthur forced his head up. At first he saw nothing. Then a dark shape emerged through the white, larger with every second, moving not in panic but with deliberate focus. Echo. Arthur tried to call his name, but only a broken sound came out. It was enough. Echo found him the way he had learned everything important by sound, by scent, by memory, by the invisible map built over years of patience and repetition. He came close, stopped, lowered his body slightly and pressed against Arthur's side, blocking the worst of the wind with his own mass. Warmth, not much, but enough to feel like mercy. Arthur's hand found the horse's neck, then his mane. His fingers barely worked, but they held. He could not climb onto Echo's back. He knew that instantly. His leg would not let him. His strength would not let him. So Echo did something no one in town would have believed if they had not seen the ending with their own eyes. He stayed beside Arthur, step by step, brace by brace. Arthur dragged himself upright against the horse's shoulder, half falling into him, one hand twisted deep in mane, the other clutching at coarse winter hair. Echo adjusted with every stagger. When Arthur slipped, Echo slowed. When the wind shoved, Echo leaned harder. He did not rush. He guided, one step, then another, toward home, toward the bells. That was the key. Faint beneath the storm, Arthur began hearing them too, the small metal notes along the fence line, the ones he had hung year by year, post by post, never imagining they would one day become a lifeline. Echo followed them through the white, each sound a marker, each marker a promise remembered. At the yard, the crowd had nearly stopped speaking. People listened instead. Then someone near the gate narrowed his eyes and pointed. There! Out of the blizzard came a shape so strange at first it barely looked real. Echo emerged first, snow-caked, steady, head low against the wind. And leaning against him, half carried by will and memory and animal loyalty, came Arthur Hale. Mara gasped and ran forward. Hands flew to mouths. Men who had spent their lives explaining animals in terms of use and price said nothing at all. Even the wind seemed, for one suspended second, to lose its voice. Arthur nearly collapsed at the porch steps, but Echo held steady until others reached him. "Easy," Arthur whispered, though whether he was speaking to himself or the horse, no one could tell. Wade stood motionless near the gate. The sight of him there mattered, because shame, when it finally arrives, should have a witness. This was the man who had laughed at the blind foal, the man who had called Echo useless, costly, dangerous, disposable. And now that same horse stood steaming in the storm as the only reason Arthur Hale was still alive. Wade dropped his gaze. He started, then stopped. For once there was no joke waiting behind the words, no grin to hide inside. "I didn't think." "No," Mara said, tears freezing on her face as she looked from her father to Echo. "You didn't." No one defended him. No one needed to. Arthur was carried inside. The house exploded into motion blankets, hot water, a call for the doctor, boots stripping wet snow across the floorboards. Through it all, Echo remained in the yard under the porch light, breathing hard, calm now that the task was done. Later, when the immediate fear had loosened its grip and Arthur slept at last beneath quilts and pain and exhaustion, Mara stood alone at the mantel. For a long moment she looked at the face-down photograph. Then she reached out and turned it upright. A small sound followed in the room, not dramatic, just the soft click of frame against wood. But it meant everything. By morning, the story had already begun moving through town. Not as gossip, as correction. And the truth at its center was simple enough to shame every easy judgment that had come before it. Sometimes the souls the world calls useless are the ones built to save us. Sometimes love does not need eyes to see what matters, and sometimes the miracle is not that rescue comes. It is that someone you once mocked stayed loyal long enough to bring you home.